We have several people here. They're going to start by introducing themselves, talk a little bit about their career paths and how from fellowship has led them to what they're doing today. And really, I want this to be interactive. I know people have been somewhat quiet. We want you to ask questions, so please, this is a great opportunity to really have a chance to talk to people, endocrinologists, talk to them about their careers, talk to them about anything that is important to you. So I'm just going to introduce everybody, and then they're going to each come up and take some turns. Some have some just basic slides, some just to talk, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions. So I think we're going to start with Elizabeth Pearce, who is going to talk a little bit about her career in clinical research. Tony Bianco is on his way, and he's more of a basic scientist, and talk about his career in academics. Jennifer Lawrence, who's in private practice in Georgia, will talk a little bit about her career. And finally, Jim Magner, who is working in industry, and talk a little bit about that. So everyone will give a chance to sort of introduce themselves, and we'll go from there. Start with Elizabeth.
Hi, so this is pretty informal, and I think what we hope will come out of the session is just a chance for all of us to kind of discuss and be interactive. Just to let you know a little bit about who I am an associate professor of medicine. I'm an endocrinologist at Boston University. I have been there, I think, 12 or 13 years now. And I split my time between clinical patient care, which is mostly thyroid, but not exclusively, and have had, over the years, anywhere between 60 and 80% protected time since I started to do clinical and epidemiologic research. So my areas of interest are kind of varied. Anything that's got kind of an epidemiology, public health flavor in the thyroid. I'm interested in iodine nutrition, in environmental thyroid disruptors, in thyroid and pregnancy, in subclinical thyroid dysfunction and cardiovascular disorders. So I've worked in a bunch of areas and really enjoy doing that. I think if you're thinking about a career in clinical research, it is a competitive environment, as it is for basic science. The sad truth these days is that it's a really exciting field to work in, but funding is becoming more of a challenge for everybody. So those of us in clinical science complain that there's no money in clinical science and it's all going to the basic scientists, and then you talk to the basic scientists and they say, well, all the money's going to clinical. So I think the reality is that there's not enough money at the moment, but that, funding cycles turn around and these things change and they're always cyclic, and I'm sure it's going to be on the upswing again soon, hopefully in time for all of you. Kind of a traditional way to start an academic career would be with a K grant, which is an NIH 5-year mentored career training award. In the old days, like 10 years ago, it was fairly feasible to write a K grant in your third year of fellowship, get it funded and approved, July 1 of your fourth year, and go from there. And that's getting harder. Funding is getting tighter for K grants as it is for other grant mechanisms, although pay lines are still better for K grants than for most other grants. So there still is some hope from your perspective. There's money out there. It's doable. Almost nobody gets a K funded first time out these days. That's just sort of, sadly, kind of unheard of. No matter how good it is, you almost always have to go through 2 cycles of submission. And they are looking for, I think, in theory, you don't really need a lot of preliminary research for a K grant. Your mentoring in your institution are probably the most critical things, but I think they do want some publication track record these days. Again, just things are getting very competitive. So in thinking about how to make that step to that first training grant, which hopefully is then the stepping stone to kind of an independent research career, you kind of want to think, if you're doing clinical research, about what kind of training you need. If you're a basic scientist, it's all hands-on. You work in the lab, somebody will teach you techniques. You learn how to pipette this or to do mass spec on that. But in clinical science, it's a little bit more nebulous. There are hands-on skills you need, but it's not necessarily stuff you can pick up as easily by observation. So things like biostatistical programming, study design, often some formal training is helpful. I think it really is useful to have some formal grounding in these things, and it's also probably very helpful if you're applying for your first grant to have that academic credential, whatever it is. A master's in public health, a master's of science and epidemiology, some kind of formal certificate program. But if you want to sort of go down this career route, and there is any mechanism for that kind of formal training in epidemiology or health services research or biostatistics, I think it's helpful to have that, especially while you're training now as fellows, if it's possible to do those simultaneously, because I think that really gives you a leg up in being able to do the research, but also to be able to get it funded. And I think I'll stop there. And Jen?
Jen, this is gonna. I'll put your slides up, and I think this. You can move it with that. I believe.
Well, my slides are mainly just to keep me on track. My name is Jennifer Lawrence, and I'm in private practice in Valdosta, Georgia, which is a small city or college town in South Georgia between Jacksonville and Tallahassee. I've been in private practice since I left my fellowship in 2000. I actually, when I was sitting in the fellows track, I had no idea that I'd be doing private practice. My plans initially were to go into clinical research, but my husband, who is a rheumatologist and is from South Georgia, was a few years ahead of me, and he had gone down before while I was in training and started a private practice, and so that's why I'm there. How do I move this? Let's see. So decision regarding career choices actually wasn't a decision that I had made in fellowship. I made it in fellowship toward the end when I decided to join my husband. But I think why I enjoy private practice, some of the advantages are flexibility. I'm my own boss, and independence. And there are certainly different types of private practices, which I'll discuss. My private practice experience is actually a hybrid. I joined my husband, who was part of a multi-specialty clinic with a rheumatologist, a gastroenterologist, primary care providers. And because I loved thyroid, I wanted to make sure that I had a focus on thyroid. I have 3 days in that practice, which is actually a general endocrine practice. And because I'm the only endocrinologist where I am in about a 90-mile radius, and because South Georgia is in the diabetes belt, I knew I'd be doing a lot of diabetes. Someone very clever, and I don't even remember who it was, told me at the Joslin, when you go into private practice, see if you can separate your endocrine from your diabetes. And this person gave me great advice, because that's exactly what I did. I didn't think I could afford to, right out of fellowship, have a clinical diabetes educator myself. I asked the hospital to use their clinical, or rather their diabetes education program, which was a clinical diabetes educator and a dietitian, and I asked them to build a diabetes center. I said, I will build your diabetes center from that, which we did. And so my 2 days a week, I run a diabetes center, which is now a very big practice with some mid-levels, and we have 8 CDEs. And that is actually a hospital clinic where I am an independent contractor. And that's worked very well, because the person from the Joslin who gave me that advice said, you're going to be the only endocrinologist down there. You'll be inundated with phone calls from your diabetics, and you won't have a chance to get through all your phone calls and see patients. And that has really helped me, because I have very clever educators who can give advice that I sign off on. And we can talk about that more later if that's an interest. So that's what I do. And that's what I do is patient-centered every day. I work full-time. I basically see many patients and solve problems, and I enjoy the relationships I have with my patients. And the other advantage of private practice is there's a national shortage of endocrinologists. I'm actually looking for an endocrinologist, not to put a plug in, but you'll find that there are endocrinologists looking for partners all over the country. So you can pretty much go anywhere you want to go. The disadvantages really of any type of practice, whether it's research, that the future is unknown. So I think that it's important to be well trained, as Elizabeth was saying, so that you can be flexible. And the hours. I know there are potential that I know folks who do part-time private practice. I don't actually know any of them personally. It can be a very long and demanding day. I think if you're looking at positions, you should consider in your hours whether or not you want to be, for example, at a hospital, have consultation-only privileges versus admitting privileges. I have consultation only, otherwise I might be admitting every diabetic that comes into the hospital. And And so those are some things to think about when you're looking at different opportunities, is how you want to mold your practice. So the different types of practices that are out there, there are group practices, and you may be looking at practice if you're interested in private practice for a partner track. There's some employee, and there's solo practice, which is probably harder if you're going out from fellowship to develop, but it's possible. And there's hospital-based practices where the hospital will pay you for your clinical time. And then there's a mixture of that, sort of what I do, which is a mixture. And you can develop whatever practice you're interested in. Maybe thyroid only. There are many endocrinologists who do that, or there's folks who do diabetes only, or a mixture. When you're thinking about this, there's certainly ancillary services are important to anyone in private practice. Basically has to make their overhead. An overhead is an expense that is a daily expense for all your staff. Whether you're at work or not, you have that expense. And endocrinologists basically see patients to pay their overhead, but there's also opportunity for ancillary services, lab particularly, ultrasound. Since I'm part of a large group, we share a very nice GE ultrasound that I would never be able to afford on my own, and we actually have an ultrasonographer that I work with very closely, but she also does gallbladder and echo and other things. Bone density, X-ray, MRI, CT, these are some of the ancillary services that you'll find if you're looking at different groups that they may offer. And what are some of the challenges? Well, electronic medical record is a challenge. It's also something that's made my life easier. But I think if you're looking at practices, you should look very carefully at the EMR because you'll be spending your life intimately with that, whatever type of clinical medicine you do. Insuring and billing and coding is part of life in private practice. Folks who are in solo practice or in small may outsource some of that. Since I'm in a bigger group, that's done inside of our practice. And if you're at a hospital base, there may be RVUs where you may have a base salary, and then you may have a potential for a bonus based on your activity. And the other issue is call. I am the only person that does what I do in my town, so I'm on call every 7 days a week, 24 hours. And so the operators know me well. When I got on the airplane, I told them I'm getting on the airplane, and they know how to leave me a message. There is no one that covers for me, but that's also why I'm consultation only. Every patient has a primary doctor that will admit them. I'm available by phone always. When I'm on vacation, I'm always available. So that's the call may be something that's in different areas where you may share with other endocrinologists. You may take call on your own, and then you leave town. And so there's different things when you're looking at different opportunities that might need to be considered. And in terms of skills, I think that are useful before leaving fellowship, the ability to have credentialing in radioactive iodine ablation. At some hospitals, that may be cornered by nuclear medicine or radiology. And so I took a course before I left my fellowship, and that's been helpful. And same thing with thyroid ultrasonography, whether it's, I think it's helpful to learn how to do it yourself. You may not be doing it yourself. You may be having an ultrasonographer do that, but those skills, finding aspiration, are things you want to be accomplished in, or at least pretty comfortable with before you leave. I think I had to learn a different technique in finding aspiration when I was in practice. I learned one way at the Brigham, and the pathologists, the cytopathologists weren't comfortable with the way I was providing my information. I had to learn to make slides, which I didn't do before. So you can certainly learn techniques on the way. And if you're going to do diabetes, it's one thing is to make sure you know that you're comfortable with insulin pump management. And actually, you can learn a lot through the companies would be very happy to teach you. These are skills that I think would be wonderful if you could have before you leave your fellowship. And then other points about interaction, your relationship will be with different types of physicians, whether it's OBGYNs for gestational diabetes or thyroid. I see pregnant patients immediately that day or the next day. Surgeons who may be distant. I'm lucky enough to have Dr. Pearce not that far, maybe 4 hours. And he's certainly been wonderful for my patients and taught me a lot. Primary care physicians, one of the reasons also I decided to do consultation only, since there wasn't an endocrinologist in my town there actually was one for a few years, 10 years before I entered. Physicians weren't used to having a consultant, and if I actually did primary care, they may not have wanted to send me a patient. So there are relationships you have to be careful to develop to ensure that you're respectful of the boundaries. Diabetes educators, I I've worked very closely with the educators, and I actually asked our hospital to implement a diabetes nurse specialist who has been my lifesaver in the hospital. I've developed several glycemic protocols for our hospital that have decreased my workload, insulin drip protocols, basal bolus, and I could not have done all of these without someone inside the hospital to kind of write things up, help get through the committees, observe, make changes. It's just all that takes so much time. I couldn't have done that with someone who could spearhead some of that for me. So that's something that took almost 10 years for me to do. But if you have good relationships with folks like that, your life can really be improved. And there's physician extenders, learning how to work with those and employees. My philosophy has always been to give the best possible treatment to those who I work with, and to give the most responsibility. So my educators, after I've trained them closely, talk to patients on their own and give patients advice. That gives me the opportunity to have some more free time to do other things, but it also makes folks enjoy their jobs more. So I think these are some of the comments that the reality is when you're in private practice, it's a business, and I've always felt that the better I treat an employee, the better my patients will be cared for, and the better the relationship is. And it's also important to keep academic ties. Societies, American Thyroid Association, that has given you this opportunity will give you many opportunities throughout your career. I think one of the comments that was made in years past in this regard is that you feel like if you're going to private practice, you're maybe jumping off a cliff and you'll never see again, folks. And I think that's not true. There's still important interactions, committees, being on different committees. Those have been very rewarding for me. I don't actually have a grand rounds where I live, but that would be a wonderful opportunity to continue relationship and ties with folks who used to train with. And there's always opportunities for research. We've done pharmaceutical trials. There's physician-initiated trials, current studies. I've sent patients to the NIH for trials. You can still have relationships, case studies. So there's still a life after leaving fellowship if you're in private practice for opportunities for research. And then also political action. That's something that I actually didn't learn about until late. There's ACEPAC is probably one of the most active political action committees, part of the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology. Not all medical societies can have a political action because of the way they're built, and that gives you an opportunity to meet with your congressman, to talk about things that you know very well about. I mean, I take care of diabetics every day. I understand some of the issues that diabetics face. So when I went to Congress to talk about the a diabetes program or bill that was being passed, you can educate your congressmen, congresswomen who make the decisions actually that affect the lives of your patients. So there's opportunities for that will make your life enriching. And finally, I think it's important if you do go into practice to have someone knowledgeable look at your contract before you sign it. Peers can do that, mentors. ACE actually offers for a nominal fee an expert to look at your contract. I think that's important. And I just mentioned here John Adams, his family motto was be good, do good. I think that's very important in private practice because not only do you want to make sure that you give care to each one of your patients and to do good for them, but also to be a good physician for them, but to do good also for the community. I mean, I feel that I have a responsibility for South Georgia for providing endocrine care, and there's certainly community needs that I try to meet, just as folks do in academics, providing help for medical societies. There's a lot one can do in your community, and to remember that. And to be flexible. I certainly didn't expect to be in the position I'm in, and I think having a good attitude about anything you do, there's so many different pathways that you will be able to choose, but to be flexible is not all may go as planned, and to have an excellent attitude and be very committed to what you do, I think are important tips. And there are wonderful resources that are available that can help you both at a national and sometimes at a local chapter way that are listed there. That's it.
Okay, so I have a few minutes to talk about academic endocrinology, and Elizabeth already said something about it. let's see. My view of this is that, well, first of all, I'm Antonio Bianco. I'm Division Chief of Endocrinology at the University of Miami. I've been doing this role for the last 5 years, I think, 4 or 5 years. So I get to mentor a lot of new faculty that I hired and a lot of fellows that go through our program. So, and I see that this is where I came up with this presentation from. It's based on the hands-on experience and identifying the most relevant issues that everybody has to deal with. And one of the things that I really find interesting and important is during the fellowship, you need to identify a mentor if you want to stay. I mean, usually having a mentor is great for no matter what you're going to do at the end of the fellowship, but especially if you're going to do academic medicine at the end, you really need to have a mentor. And you will see this in a minute why this is important. And most fellowships are 2-year fellowships. So depending on the different programs have different formats, but there will be some time during these 2 years to complete your clinical training, but also to complete your sort of a research training, or at least a moment that you will have to rotate through different mentors and say, well, I wish I would be this person. I wish I would, when I graduate and I have a position, I would like to emulate what he or she do. So that's the mentor. And the mentor is critical because you don't know much. There's a lot of things that you really need to know. And having somebody that has gone through this pathway and has been successful in this pathway, that's the person that's going to tell you, do this, don't do this, or do that. And also it's going to put your name forward. I mean, your mentor, also gets credit for mentoring, so he or she would want you to succeed. And so there's a sort of a partnership there that both of you will look good if you do well. So mentors are willing to help because they need you as well. But so therefore it's really important to identify a mentor. And I see a lot of fellows that are very shy to identify a mentor and connecting with somebody in a real academic way. And I think that's a mistake. Because everything that's going to happen after the fellowship, believe it or not, depends on what happened during the fellowship. So it will be incredibly easier to pursue an academic life if you already got some data, some publications, some exposure, some experience in academic medicine during the fellowship years. After you finish with your fellowship, basically you have 3 options: physician scientist, clinician educator, or a full-time clinician. This is all in the academic setting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these 3. I understand that then Elizabeth already spoke to about clinician educator or something? No? Okay. All right. So then let's look more or less what these 3 pathways look like. But it's important that the physician scientist is that person that's going to do most of her or his time is going to be dedicated for some form of research. And there will be some clinical activity that will be variable, but usually that's a minority of your time. The majority of your time is going to be spent doing research. Then you have the clinician educator track, and that's very difficult to get. Not a lot of institutions have funds to hire somebody that's a clinician educator. Why? Because, when you're talking to the fellows, when you're teaching the fellows, you're doing this while they understand that you're supposed to teach while you're making money for them. So, to protect some of your time because you're a clinician educator, it doesn't go well in most institutions. So sometimes you will find a place that says, well, we have one person here that's the coordinator for the course. He or she are going to put together these activities. So in most divisions, you will find 1 or 2 faculty members that can be called clinician educator. It means that some of their time is protected to teach. And if that's what you want to do, that's terrific. For example, a fellowship director will come from somebody that decided to be on that track. If you want to do that, sometimes, if you're lucky, there's an opening, or sometimes what you have to do is you have to start as a full-time clinician in the division, and then slowly convince your division chief or convince the dean or the dean's office that you're doing a great job as a teacher as well. So with time, they will protect some of your time, and then you could transition from being a full-time clinician into clinician educator. So going into one of these three tracks depends basically on what you want out of your life. And most institutions would welcome the physician scientists, provided that they already have a grant or that they already have substantial preliminary data that was generated during the fellowship, so that they can evaluate and say, well, yes, I can see this data. You actually worked for 2 years under your mentor during the fellowship. It will be very easy to put together a career development award or some form of career development support that you will go then into the physician scientist track. If you just finish your fellowship and say, I want to be a physician scientist, it's going to be very hard to get a position for that, because it means you will need a lot of support from the institution. And the institution wants to hire individuals that already have something that will ensure their success. So I already said that not a lot of positions available for clinician educator. So your best shot, which would be the easiest way to get into academic endocrinology in a specific division, will be to be hired as a full-time clinician. You can negotiate and say, what does it mean to be a full-time clinician? Does it mean I'm going to have how many clinics per week? Am I going to have, if it's one FTE, and FTE is this full-time equivalent, this is what you really need before you accept any job. You need to see, please explain to me what's going to be my FTE. What's my clinical FTE? What is my protected time? How many clinics do I have to have? And this is the kind of negotiation. The division chief has some room to negotiate with you, but basically the more you do, the better for the division chief, because you're going to make more money. So the more clinics you have, you're going to generate more money. But then you need to think that what is my career going to look like if I say, oh yeah, I want to please this guy, I want to get this job, so I agree to do 8 clinics per week. But you need to understand that after 5 years of doing 8 clinics per week, it's going to be a very, very heavy. It's a lot of patients, and because of money constraints, they're going to try to put as many patients as they can possibly put in your clinics. So it will be very important, if you were deciding to go as a full-time clinician, to have some sort of protected time, at least in the beginning, that you don't have a lot of experience with electronic medical record, because once you get these things going, things are easier, but especially in the beginning, it's really tough. These are those career development awards that I spoke to you about. The NIH usually gives these out to outstanding candidates, and everything that depends on the NIH these days, it's going to be very difficult, but I don't want to be negative. The pathway is there, the track is there. The VA, if you have some aides at the VA, meaning if you have a position that it's together with the university, but some of your salary might come from some time that you're going to do at the VA. The VA has also the CD pathways that are called career development pathways. But also societies have. The American Diabetes Association has career development awards. The American Heart Association has the career development awards. So you can actually get very good awards from these societies, and not only from the NIH. And that's going to support your protected time with being a physician scientist. So therefore, if you really want to be a physician scientist, and you realize that to obtain this career development awards, you need data, you need to have done something already during your fellowship, and you actually didn't have much time during the fellowship, so you might want to convince the program director or the division chief to hold you longer for the third year in that fellowship. Some programs already start with a 3-year program, with the third year being a research year, and some programs not. Some programs will just commit to 2 years, and depending on how good you are, they're going to give you a third year. But that third year should be completely focused on obtaining preliminary data or already working on your submission that's going to support your career development award. And this is what, if you're successful, and this is what your life is going to look like for the rest of your life. Your one FTE is going to be split in, let's say, 10-20% clinical activity, and the rest of your salary will have to come from grants. And that's the very, very tough part, because in some institutions, that means that if you don't have the grants, you don't have a salary. So if you was not able to renew your grant, they might give you some bridge support for 1 or 2 years. Say, well, let's see, you're going to resubmit this grant and let's see if you're successful. But then if you're not successful, it means you have to change tracks. Or you just, if there is an opening as a full-time clinician, you just say, well, I don't have this research money anymore, so now fill out my clinic time, and that will pay for my salary. That's a possibility, and a lot of physicians do that. But that's basically what you do. You submit grants to the NIH, and you pay part of your salary with that money that it's coming. And the clinical activity support is coming from the division. Now, you also, it's wonderful to have a mentor that can continue with you, or even if that original mentor from the fellowship is not the person that's going to guide you, it's also a very good idea to, even if you're already a more senior investigator, to have somebody that can help you with these grants. I mean, it's really very critical, because the level of professionalism, not professionalism, but the level of the quality of the grants is so dramatic at the NIH when you're being compared with everybody else nationally and internationally, that if you don't have a perfect grant, you're not going to get funded. So, and it's hard to get a perfect grant, when you're young. So that's why you need a mentor to look at your grants and give you feedback before you go and you submit your grant. Interesting thing is that while you do all this, you actually become a mentor for the fellows that are coming from the fellowship, because your job is to write grants and get money, but who's going to do the work that you got the money for? I mean, it's not going to be you, because you can't do the work, see the patients, and write the grants. So you need to have the fellows to work with you, and that completes the cycle. So while you're doing all this, you actually become a mentor for young fellows that are coming and are going to work on your grants. So that's how it works, and that's how it should start. That's why, when you identify that mentor in the beginning, you want to make sure that mentor you identified has grants that will be able to support your work, and in the future you want to become one of them. Now, the clinician educator already mentioned something. Usually it's 50-50, but any combinations that, this is usually should be flexible. You would be teaching the fellows. You could be the fellowship director according to the ACGME guidelines. I think it's 25%. I mean, if your program has maybe 6 or 8 fellows, it will be 25%. So a clinician educator will have 25% already protected for being a fellowship director, for example. And then you will have some patient interaction as well. Now, if you don't have any of that protected time, if you don't have grants that protect your time, if you don't have teaching protected time from the dean's office and from the medical school, you have to see patients. And usually divisions will assign, so how many patients do you have to see? It will vary according to different institutions, but my advice to you is make sure you understand what you're signing up to. Because they can measure your time based on the number of clinics that you have to do, or depending on the number of RVUs that you have to do. And it's really hard to tell which one is more convenient for you. It depends on what the reality of the institution you're looking at the position. Usually, RVUs can be matched with national guidelines. There are places that will publish national guidelines for RVUs. Last year was an endocrinologist at the 50th percentile of an endocrinologist working here in the United States would produce 4,800 RVUs in a year. Well, what does this number mean? Well, basically, depending on the billing that you do, a new patient will give you maybe 2 or 3 RVUs. A follow-up visit will give you 1 or 1.5 RVUs, depending on the level that you bill. If you're doing inpatient consult service for the hospital, that's the activity that generates most RVUs. That will be like between 3 and 4 RVUs for a consultation. So you really need to learn all this so that you don't accept the most difficult tasks. So when it's time, who's going to do the consult service? Okay, I'm going to be on call, but because being on call generates a lot of RVUs. So you really need to understand this before you sign up to do something. RVUs is usually easier. It's easier to achieve RVU targets than the time, because if you commit to having 8 clinics per week, you have to be sitting there for 8 times a week for 4 hours each time. And then it really doesn't matter how many RVUs you're making. I mean, you're just seeing the patients that they're telling you to see. So the time and the RVU are 2 different ways that your clinical activity can be evaluated and accounted for, and you guys need to see what's the best situation in that particular institution that you're looking at. Per year, yes. And those are the important points that I thought were worth mentioning to you. I don't know if we're going to later on have a debate or if questions can be asked.
Yeah, questions. They'll have an opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you very much.
Or a debate.
Okay, so we will have time for discussion of all this, I think, in the last 20 minutes or so, but I'm going to take about 10 or 12 minutes just to give you the overview of what it would be like to consider a career in industry. So I was born in a small town in Illinois. I went to college and medical school in Illinois. After my training in internal medicine and endocrinology, I loved being a young faculty member at a teaching hospital in Chicago. I loved seeing patients, and I loved having a small lab and applying for grants. So all the things that you've already heard about, that's sort of what I was doing for about 9 years. And I loved it. I loved seeing patients, and I loved trying to, work with animals and doing interesting biochemical experiments and so on. But there's the challenge of the stress and the time it takes to see patients, and also the stress of trying to apply for scientific grants. And after a total of 14 years in academics, I no longer could get my NIH grants funded. It was just too competitive. And I wasn't sure, even though I loved seeing patients with about half of my time or a third of my time, I was sure that I didn't want to see patients with all of my time, because I'm basically a scientist at heart. So that's just a personal choice. So my first point is that there's no right answer. That's the general answer. Each of you have your own preferences, your own interests, and if you're going to do something with your life, you need to do something that you're interested in being committed to. And actually, unfortunately for me, even though I was an MD, I was not interested in being a full-time clinical physician. I wanted to do something in addition to that. So I looked into the possibility of joining industry. And I just want to point out on the title slide that I have a couple of roles. And some of you, know a lot about, you've been to medical school and you've been in fellowship, so you know what academics is, and you know what seeing patients is about. But some of you may not know much about medical affairs or clinical development. And so in the next 10 minutes, I'll try to explain a little bit about what those 2 roles are and what other roles could be in industry, and why would this be useful to do. So I want to first, before I go into the roles, I want you to consider what might be some of the advantages and also some of the disadvantages of even starting to think about this option of an industry career. So I list here that I'm just going to quickly run through them. You get to, if you join a pharmaceutical or biotech company, you get to work on the cutting edge of science, obviously. It's the newest potential medicines or newest potential approaches. They're not approved yet. You generally have plenty of resources to support the projects. So you don't have to worry about arguing with insurance companies, and you don't have to write grants. So as long as you can land the job, and if you're good at what you do, there's plenty of resources. So that's an advantage. However, then you have to perform. Because obviously if you are not good at what you do or whatever, they could hire someone else. Okay? You have a job review at the end of every year. So no job is without its pressures. But I found it a relief after not being able to get my grants funded to be in an environment where there were plenty of resources. So if I wanted to go to this ATA meeting or that meeting or any meeting in the entire world, I could just buy a ticket. So that's the next point, able to attend any scientific meeting. Of course, it has to be relevant to what you're doing. And then, of course, you make personal contacts with key academic researchers and top doctors and scientists in all the different countries everywhere. You get to exercise creativity and strategic planning, study design, data analysis, report writing. Also, you get to give a lot of oral and written presentations. All of that's very academic. You can still interact with your basic science colleagues as well as your clinical colleagues, both inside and outside the company. You work with extremely high-quality colleagues. People in industry generally are very smart. They're verbal people. They're interesting people. They have a wide range of backgrounds. And I don't want to say anything derogatory about other environments, but sometimes at big state medical schools or whatever, the staff that are there are not necessarily best in the world. Now, why would it, in a company, the staff that's your secretary, the people in the library, the people that tech support, all the people you interact with every day, why are they the best in the world? It's because after a couple of years, if they're not performing at an extremely high level, they're told, you did a great job, fantastic, we don't need you anymore, goodbye. So that's different than a university job. So everybody, there's a turnover, and then people accumulate who are extremely highly qualified. You get generally a very good salary and benefits without wrangling with the insurance companies. And we take some heat for this because some of my friends said, well, you just went into an industry job because you can make a lot of money. First of all, I don't make a lot of money. I make a fair salary that's on the higher end of what maybe other people working 40 hours, 50 hours a week would make. But you just heard Tony say, well, you have to make the money. You got to see patients, and it's very important. You have to do these RVUs and spend the time. So my impression is I've gone around to, I've been doing this for 10 years now, that the focus on the money is higher in academics. Making the money, getting the grant, you have to have the money. Whereas in academics, they say, we need you to go research this topic. Why don't you write up something about this in about a week? And I go to the library, or I maybe have to fly somewhere and meet with some doctors. It's actually, in many ways, more academic than academics. Because I just get a salary every 2 weeks. I don't have to show certain numbers of patients that I've seen or something like that. You have important project deadlines, and you have important busy periods. But there's usually no difficulty taking time off for holidays and vacations. So I was very dedicated to patients when I saw patients. But if I go on vacation or something like that, I don't have to carry a beeper. I don't have anything like that. On the weekends, I generally don't have to, unless I want to, unless I have a deadline on Tuesday or something that I would want to do something on the weekends, then I can do that. You have time available to read journals and texts and get to stay up on the very latest in science and medicine, including a lot of unpublished information because you're talking with thought leaders around the world. You can still engage in teaching activities within one's project teams within the company. And it's very easy if there's an issue with a company or a family issue and you want to change cities or something. Once you have some experience and you have a pretty good track record, it's really not a problem to move from one company to another. And many of the people, I've worked at Bayer and I've worked at Genzyme, a lot of the people I work with have a history that they, oh yeah, well, I used to work for Pfizer and before that I used to work for Merck. So it's not uncommon for people to have that sort of a history. Of course, there are some disadvantages, and I want to try to give a balanced presentation. In general, you would have little or no direct patient contact, although you may, for let's say one afternoon a week or one afternoon every 2 weeks, choose to set up an endocrine arrangement at a local university or a local hospital. Generally, you don't bill anything, or if that's variable, but you teach their fellows. And of course, then it's an issue who's going to be in call. If you draw a TSH level and it comes back 2 days later when you're not there anymore, who's going to check that value? So that all has to be worked out. So the most comfortable would be that you're there to spend time and see patients with the fellows. You have to have a license in that state, but that you actually don't bill anything and you're just there kind of volunteering your time to help talk about the cases with the fellows. Usually one no longer publishes as a first author or a key author or gives major presentations at scientific meetings, which is very different than in academic research where you're trying to struggle and get the publications and you'd like to be the one to give the plenary lecture at the ATA. So here you feel confident, you just step back. And if you're running a big study on some topic, you let the global experts perform the study. You may have written the protocol, but they're doing the study, and then you let them work on the paper. You help make sure it's correct because you have access to all the computer database of the study. But you may not even be an author on the paper, or you may be the 10th author on the paper. So you have to be comfortable with that. The goal is not to enhance one's own prestige as a leader in medicine, but instead is the success of the project. You're usually not directly part of a university. There's usually no academic appointment, with little opportunity for teaching medical students, residents, or fellows. You must begin for the first time in your life to take care about confidential and proprietary information. And also, frankly, when I changed after 14 years from academics to industry, some people that I'd worked with previously thought this was strange. Some people harbor a negative view of the pharma industry, and they may change the way they think about you. So you have to be mentally prepared for that. If you're thinking about this opportunity, you have to think specifically what type of medical role. The main ones are clinical development, medical affairs, pharmacovigilance, and then you can be like an MD, PhD person with some basic research. Consider the size of the company. It's very different if you work in a big multinational company, a medium-sized, small one with only 1 or 2 marketed products. You could join a startup with no marketed products, okay? But they should have a compound in late-stage development. Or you could join an early startup with no products at all and no compounds. That's pretty high risk. So what I did is I joined the big German company, Bayer, which was in the first group, a large multinational corporation, because when I joined industry, I knew absolutely nothing of how to be an industry physician. So I started on the bottom and learned how to do it over about a 6-year period. After about 4 or 5 years, you get good. If if you pay attention and you learn. It's like I had multiple mentors at the company. You can decide as you're choosing what role, and I'll explain more about the roles in a minute, and the size of the company, especially if you go to a smaller company with only a couple of products, what type of drug are you interested in to be working with? And also the location. You could pick the country. You don't have to stay in the U.S. Or the state. Do you want to live in a bigger city or a smaller city? What about the roles? So the next 2 slides, I'm going to show the 4 roles. So clinical development is what I've spent most of my time doing, and the unofficial brief definition, in quotes there, is invent new drugs and get them registered with governments in various countries with an emphasis on the U.S. and Europe. That's FDA and EMA. To do that, you work with a very experienced team of bright and committed people, both people inside the company and external experts. To do this, you have to have very good communication skills, word processing. You have lots and lots of local meetings about the project. You have to have good analytical skills, solving puzzles, data analysis. You're giving oral presentations within the company about the latest issue, problem, what you think the 3 possible solutions are, and back and forth with people. You do participate in the publication of results, although sometimes not as a co-author. And there's about 10% of your time is travel, and this would be global. You would be involved mostly in phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical study design, data analysis, and writing of reports. And that's a very simplified description. But let me, in the interest of time, move ahead to medical affairs, because now you saw my title, I'm doing both. So medical affairs, sort of the quotation mark there definition is you interact with prescribers, disease experts, scientific and patient organizations regarding the adoption and the use of approved drugs. So unlike the top where you're trying to invent a new drug and get it registered, here you're trying to have a marketed drug have more use or to have expanded use. So you help the sales teams, and you have other roles like that. You have to review marketing materials, help train the sales teams, and so there's an academic component there. We have like ISS studies, investigator-sponsored studies, and also grants. You might be involved in phase 4 studies, post-approval studies. You help to organize and run physician advisory boards to get advice from experts. You travel to meet doctors, maybe about 20% travel time. And remember that a sales representative, like are at the exhibits down the hall, they only can answer questions about on-label indications. But as a medical affairs person, you can also answer questions off-label for things that have been published about your drug, but it's not actually approved by the regulators. Pharmacovigilance is another role. That is to be an expert on a specific drug or drugs regarding adverse events, how to assess events that occur, and how to formally report to regulators safety events or trends. And there are many laws and rules about how to do it. This is more of a legalistic, it's medical, but it's a very legalistic, detailed sort of a role. As safety questions come up during the design of phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 and investigator-sponsored studies, you may get involved. Some data analysis, evaluation of, and regulatory reporting of safety events, including post-marketing assessments and reporting. Much of the work is routine with well-defined steps and procedures. You have mostly internal roles and very little travel. So this is a very different role, and I thought it was actually sort of a narrow role and a very legalistic role. It's one that didn't appeal to me, but some people love this. And finally, there's something that you probably are more familiar with would be, you might be an MD, but you would help with basic research. You would conduct bench research using laboratory equipment, assays, animals, and so on. And you would provide hands-on expertise in the lab, but you would have a little bit different perspective because you're an MD. before you even consider any of this, now that you know advantages, disadvantages, and the roles, I would advise you to take very seriously some general career advice. You need to know really what you are interested in doing. And then don't do what other people expect you to do. Do what you want to do. You have to know yourself. This takes time. For example, you might need to read some things that you normally wouldn't read, or go to a museum, or check out something that you normally wouldn't have taken the time to do. You need to have specific goals and think about them. You need to pay attention to family, have a stable, family situation. Guard your health. Be open to chance events. This comes back to something that Jennifer had said, that she didn't know she was going to be in South Georgia. Well, I didn't know I was going to be working for Genzyme. But you need to be open to chance events and be comfortable with kind of being shifted back and forth and around and making the best of various situations that arise. So don't be hyper right now as you're finishing your fellowships, that I don't know what I want to do, I don't know what to do. You need to be good at what you do, okay, be well trained, and then be open to chance events, and be smart about what you choose to do. You need to work hard, and you're working on 20 things at once, but you need to do the best that you can at whatever you happen to be working on at the moment. So if you're dictating a discharge report or whatever you're doing, or making a PowerPoint presentation, I got 20 minutes I have to make this PowerPoint presentation. For that 20 minutes, you focus and you do the best you can do on that thing. Then, of course, the next 20 minutes, you're doing something else. Okay? You need to pay attention to money. Money is very, very important. But it's not important as an end. It's only important as a tool to allow you to accomplish the goals that you have in your life and to do the proper things for your family and so on. So you need to be very careful about your thinking about that. And then you're going to have to get a job and do something, so you need to start something a year or two from now. But then if it doesn't seem to be right for you, you need to avoid any rash career changes, but after a time, be ready to make a change to better align your work with your goals, and you need to be courageous about that. And if you've actually been saving your money and putting some money in the bank, you can decide, I'm going to move to San Francisco now and take this opportunity. And if you weren't being careful and not putting a little money in the bank during your first couple years of working, you might not be in the position where you would feel comfortable making that change. So these things are sort of tied together. This is my last slide. As physicians, we have had value in hearing a lecture, or there are different ways that we get educated. But traditionally in medicine, one of the most valuable ways to learn something is by a case. So you hear about a severe case of hyperthyroidism or a severe case of congestive heart failure, and then you see what the doctors did, and then they maybe made some mistakes, and then they did something a little different. But there really are very few cases written up about someone in endocrinology finding their way through the various pitfalls and problems through different careers, and then actually ending up in the pharmaceutical industry. So I wrote up sort of a little case story, and I'm not really trying to plug it, but just in case, I think it's useful if there's a few of you who might want to actually read through a case and kind of see in more detail what I've tried to explain today in 10 minutes. And my hobby is chess, and the idea is that you can balance your career and your family, and in this case chess, but any other hobby. And Jennifer mentioned this too, you have to have other interests besides just your work to keep yourself a well-rounded person. I was asked to speak to Google, the Google employees, and they put that on the internet, so you have this in your handout book so you can check it out. And of course, I've been very interested in education for a number of years, and if any of you over the next couple months have questions about any of this, I'd be happy to get an email from you, and I'll try to respond within a day. So I think we're going to have a more general discussion now, and so thank you very much for your attention.
I think if the four of you could come up, I think that's probably easier, and if people have questions.
Thank you for the very nice presentations. Can you tell us more about, this is another industry job like Covance, which basically does not have their own drugs, but they run studies for other people.
Yeah. Why don't I answer for a minute, and then maybe Elizabeth or Tony may have some experience with working with those sorts of things. So in my company, we may have an idea we make Thyrogen, so we may have an idea about a study we want to do with Thyrogen. And so my job would be to research what it is we might want to do, and actually to work with a statistician and other people to write a protocol. But then we would engage some external investigators, and they might have usually small changes that they would want to the protocol, because if we're spending a lot of money, we get to call the shots for really what we want to do basically in the protocol, but the investigators may adjust a detail here or there, okay? But then the issue is how to execute it. And if we're doing a global study at 25 centers in 8 different countries, it's pretty hard for Jim Magner in Boston to figure out how to manage it. I mean, I'm a medical person, not an expert at all that complicated management. And so a company like Covance, it's a global company. They have offices in countries all over the world, and they have employees in countries all over the world, and they have a lot of experience both at monitoring and helping out with clinical trials, and also for a fee, you pay them to manage this. And also sometimes you can have a central laboratory do certain of the tests, like the TG test or TSH, or sometimes all the labs would be done at a central laboratory so that all the normal ranges are the same. And so the company would write the protocol, and we would engage investigators, and then Covance would manage the study. And I think there are some physicians at some of these big companies like Covance and Quest and so on. And I don't know exactly what percent of time they do what in those companies. Did you two have anything else to say? Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Lawrence. You mentioned that you went to Valdosta, Georgia, and I think at the time you were the only endocrinologist in the area. Did you find that the primary care providers, such as the family practice physicians, internal medicine physicians, and nurse practitioners, were they reluctant to refer people to you, or that wasn't a problem when you initially came? And if they were, what kinds of things did you do to kind of overcome that, thinking that maybe you were encroaching upon their territory and maybe, you'd steal their patients, that sort of thing, since perhaps they had been managing some of those problems themselves? So would you comment on that? Thank you.
Sure. So when I started, I was booked out for several months, many new patients every day. So in general, people knew that I was coming, and my practice put out an announcement and the hospital put out an announcement, and I was very busy. However, there certainly were physicians who were reluctant to refer patients to me. And when I got to know some of these physicians through maybe working in the hospital or by giving talks, and by seeing how other patients are managed, they realized that I wasn't, in the diabetes center, for example, going to be stealing the patient. So there were some physicians that were reluctant. I think they thought maybe they would lose a patient. But most, I think through just practice, how I practiced, and it became knowledgeable that I wouldn't take a patient, that we were there to be helpful. And in fact, at the diabetes center, when a physician referred a patient to the clinic side, we ensured those patients kept going to their primary care provider. We were very careful to make sure notes were very quickly turned around in the physician's office. And we usually often would ask things such as, we think this patient needs to see a nephrologist. Which nephrologist would this primary care provider like to see? So we were very careful about that. And then we also unloaded all the phone calls. All the glycemic phone calls came through the diabetes center. So physicians realized, this is a great thing for me. My patient can be managed. I don't have the burden. And any kind of problems, the diabetes center will take care of. So that now our waiting list is beyond a year out. So I think it's really, you will begin, and the way you practice, your reputation will be built that way. That varies for me, and so does it vary inside the hospital. A couple weeks ago, I had 14 patients to see within an hour in the hospital, which is not possible, so I was going back at different times. But usually for me in the hospital, it would be 4 or 5, and some days none. The diabetes center, we don't see as many patients. Our clinic visits are much more intense. In my office, if I'm seeing thyroid, I may, I always see over 30 patients in my office a day. But some of that's variable. At the diabetes center, it's fewer than that, but I'm also overseeing 2 mid-levels who are seeing patients. So we may only see together 40, 45. And if I'm doing biopsies, I usually do biopsies one afternoon a week, so it's sort of dedicated time on the ultrasound, and I typically don't do more than 5. Then I'll go back and see news after that. I will say that I started off a lot slower, and that number would be intimidating probably. I don't actually know how many patients, Elizabeth, you had seen. I think when I was a fellow, it was sort of 15 per day for half clinic was sort of the thing, but some of it depends on news versus follow-ups. So that number may vary. If you're seeing an established practice and you're just seeing follow-ups, that number may be a lot higher, but it's very quick. I see probably 6 new patients a day when I'm in clinic, and then the rest is follow-ups.
So can I follow up on that question? Because you said a lot of numbers and I didn't pay attention. Maybe I didn't. So did you say at some point you see 30 outpatient per day? 30?
That would probably be a typical day. Some days I'll see more than that, some days less.
No. So just as I compare, excuse me, I'm not going to take your time.
You're all choked up about it.
Right. I just want to put this into perspective because a lot of my faculty come to me and say, listen, you're killing me. You're not paying me a good salary. I'm going to work in the community because they pay much more than you're paying. And so that's it. I'm going to resign. I said, but pay attention because when you go in the community, I mean, I'm not sure how many patients you're going to see. So I guess...
Is that number more, you think?
Right. So I'm thinking...
Yeah. That's more than an academic.
So my clinic, on Tuesday, just because I was out this week, on Tuesday now when I come back, I have a full day of clinic. And I have already 20 patients scheduled. And I already told my assistant, next time you do 20 patients in a day for me, you're going to kill me. You can't do this. So 20 is sort of in the academic setting, I think is a record. I don't know if anybody that will do more than 20 patients.
I've been doing this for 12 years, and I don't know what my schedule was when I started. It probably was 12 new patients a day, and then it became 16, But one thing that I see patients of any insurance with or without money, because I'm the only one, I feel that's an important service. Some of the patients I'm seeing back are very quick. Someone coming back for an annual Hashimoto's is a quick visit. But I do work long hours and work through lunch. It is a physically grueling day. Patients will ask me, how do you stay fit? And I'll say, I just go to clinic. I mean, I actually do more than that, but I am I'm running, I'm very fast moving in the hospital also between different wards, because when I walk into a patient room, I want to make sure that I give that patient my full attention, and I try to make the patient feel that I have all day with them. But I don't know what other practicing endocrinologists do, but in order to pay your overhead, particularly if you're seeing different insurances, and I have patients.
I think that this is what you're describing.
That's probably.
I know others.
But the other thing is that I'm used to doing this. I do this every day, and so I've gotten more efficient at how to do this.
And in the academic setting, sort of more traditionally 12 patients, half-day session, 10 or 12. But bear in mind that many academic centers, including my own, the infrastructure may not be as good. The number of people to get patients in and out the door may not be as good as what you have for private.
Right. Now I have 3 rooms, and I have a very efficient staff. If I'm talking about not the diabetes center where we see fewer people, but you develop an efficiency that way because that's all that we do. And so we have a pretty big staff. We have 3 receptionists between my husband and me, and we have a triage person that's separate than the nurse. So there's a team.
Jennifer, could you also comment on your writing your notes and your EMR and doing all the documentation for 30-some patients in a day?
So everyone does this differently. In 2007, we adopted electronic medical record. We use eClinicalWorks. And I started dictating because I could not keep up typing, particularly as all of these patients had to have a record that they didn't have before we went from a paper chart over. My husband uses Dragon and is very quick at that. When I started using Dragon, I was frustrated by the errors. And I actually can type pretty fast. So what I do may not be typical, but I dictate new patients and some complicated follow-up patients. And the other ones I just do only by writing. So when a patient comes in and I'm talking to them, some things I may put in already, and I may do a hybrid and dictate something. So I pay a transcriptionist who knows how to go into my electronic medical record. Sometimes I can write a little HPI on a simple patient who's talking and talking and talking. I can write that HPI as I listen, and get it done. But there is of course, I pay a transcriptionist to put that in, but for me, in order to see the volume I'm asked to see, it's worth it. So I do a lot of dictating as well, which may actually change with meaningful use. That may not be possible, so we'll have to see how that works.
I just wanted to point out that wherever you go to work, don't go to Korea, because I just came back from visiting, and in a 4-hour session, they see up to 100 patients.
Right.
I'm not kidding.
Little perspective for all of you.
Yeah, at the beginning I thought they were just pulling my leg, but it is the truth.
This question is for Dr. Lawrence. When you first started the Joslin Clinic at the hospital, how did you manage to convince them, and what resources did you use to get it started?
Well, I think I'm in an unusual situation. My town did not have an endocrinologist, and they were very excited about having an endocrinologist. I actually, between my residency and my fellowship, to be near my husband, I was an emergency room doctor. So I did know the hospital. I worked at that hospital as an emergency room doctor. And I just basically said, well, this is what I'd like to do. I would mirrored the experience I had at Joslin as a fellow, but we didn't have an ophthalmologist or a nephrologist there. So basically, we just sort of started. I taught the educator how I liked it. We came up with a form. This hospital, everything that's being used has to be approved. It has to be a form. So I developed a form, I think I just said this is what I wanted to do, and they just let me have it, But they knew, too, that I'd already been a physician in that area, and they knew I was going to provide a service, so they were pretty willing. I used to, about 5 years into it, I used to worry very much at night whether we were having enough income coming into the clinic to pay the overhead of all the individuals that are now employed because I had come into this area. And then someone in the hospital did a study looking at length of stay in the hospital for diabetics compared to non-diabetics. And then they also looked at those diabetics had been through our diabetes center and found that any patient had gone through the diabetes center didn't have the same length of stay as the other diabetics. And so they learned a potential, it was a huge number that we don't actually get paid at the diabetes center, but that it was like $1 million that wouldn't have been lost because these patients got out quickly. And as hospitals are paid by their diagnosis and they're not paid if the patient gets to stay a few days longer, once that data came out and the administrators, I realized I didn't need to worry so much about us paying our overhead because we do a lot of indigent care, and the hospital never bothered us because they realized that they were saving money, basically. I see patients that come from 2 hours away to us, but we have to prioritize the counties that feed into this hospital. I don't know if I answered your question. Basically, for me, I just said this is how I want to do it, and they never knew any difference, so they said, okay.
Same as with your husband.
Well, I came to South Georgia, so that was my compromise.
Do RVUs depend on coding patterns? For instance, if two physicians are seeing the same, like a patient with the same complexity, and they code it differently, would that affect the RVUs?
Absolutely, and there are complexities upon complexities upon complexities about billing. I learn more every time I review it with somebody who's really good at it, and I think I still don't know possibly as much as I should.
A question for Dr. Pearce. Two questions. One is that in your private, you said you are doing consultative private practice. So how often do you discharge patient from your practice? And the other question is that when you're making your schedule, how do you make sure you have some open slots for the patients that need to be seen very early?
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought this was initially for... So what I actually do is I start later. I have 2 children, 8 and 10. I drop them off at school. That's for me, 8 o'clock. I don't always have the same number of patients in the hospital to see, but I start my clinic at 9:20. If I have several patients in the hospital, I see them before coming to clinic. If I know I don't have that many patients, that's my work-in slot. So I can tell a surgeon who calls and says, I have a patient that was referred to me for surgery, but this patient has Graves. Can you see the patient tomorrow? I can say, I have the patient there at 8:40, and I'll know, or 8:30 to do the paperwork. So that's kind of how I work that in. And then my office, the reason I see a lot of patients is because I probably don't say no. I work patients in kind of wherever. But for me, I have that spot in the morning. Now, my husband goes to the hospital at 7 or 7:30, so he's rounding earlier, and he starts his clinic at 8 o'clock. He has his first patient. But because I have 2 kids that I like to stay home and make their lunches and drop them to school, I do it. That's how I do it. I'm sorry, what was the other question? Oh, consultation, how do I dismiss a patient?
Yeah, how do you discharge a patient from your practice?
There's 2 different things. One is returning a patient to their primary care provider. For example, that varies. I don't think I necessarily have a rule, but if I have a patient referred for Graves' disease and I've taken care of the Graves, maybe they've had reactive iodine and they're stable, once they're stable, I may return them. Some of those patients would like to stay for once-a-year visits just to be involved in case they get pregnant or something. So that sort of depends. Some patients come from very far away, so I will return them with the option to come back if needed, if things don't go as well. Diabetics, we typically don't return to their primary care provider until if they're very stable, we feel that they're really too easy for our clinic, and then we may actually see them once a year instead of every 3 months. And that's different than dismissing a patient. At the diabetes center, I think we have probably 10 patients in 12 years we've actually dismissed, so very few, and that's for people who don't show to their appointments. And in my office, if you miss 3, sometimes it stretches because I'm a softie, but appointments, I won't see you back, So that's different, though, than returning. And I think that ability to know how to return patients is important, because otherwise you don't have spots for more patients. So I usually try to fix the problem. Hyperparathyroidism, that's easy. You fix the problem, they go back. Addison's patients, they never leave you, that kind of thing.
Somebody wants to work in the lab as a scientist without any previous lab experience. How many days can you learn all to be?
Yeah, so you're talking about during your fellowship. you need probably at least 1 year experience in a lab. Well, when I worked at NIH during my fellowship, I would have a Tuesday afternoon clinic for all 3 years I was at NIH. So you always have that. But the rest of your time, let's say for a year, would need to be focused on learning some techniques and assays and how to do something. At least a year. Well, you would be credible to be able to perhaps do another year. I mean, as Tony said, that if you've done well your second year and with a big commitment to the lab, then you could talk to the boss and say, I'd like to see if I could stay another year. I'll certainly do clinic, I'll do consultations, I'll help teach the first year fellows, but I'd like to have some time during a third year when I could actually get some publications out. You couldn't learn lab stuff and everything and then get publications out all in 1 year. The last thing I want to quickly mention is just a plug. If any of you are seriously interested in exploring a ground floor industry career, some of the companies I think may be interested in talking to you, including my company, Genzyme, because we're looking for a young person who's trained in endocrine to take on the medical affairs role at a junior level for the United States. So that's always an option. That job will probably be open another 3 or 4 months, and then we'll hire someone.
So I wanted to follow up on this, what you just said. So it might be complex for fellows to see an opening in this industry environment. Well, they have their contact with their mentors on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. They're very biased towards academic life or private practice. Yeah. But how do they, get an edge on in a big pharma company or a small pharma company? Do they have to look for job offers, or is there a sort of internship that they can apply for, visiting?
So the quick answer is that I was an expert at academics, and then I couldn't get my grant renewed, and I was also very comfortable seeing patients, but I didn't want to see patients 100%. So I went for a job interview at Bayer Corporation in West Haven, Connecticut, because I didn't want to live in New Jersey. Nothing against New Jersey, but I wasn't sure. I'm from a small town in Illinois, okay? That's my background. So I thought a small town in Connecticut, West Haven, Connecticut, which is not too far from New York City, would be more my background. So I went there, and I had like 5 interviews the first day. And they said, so we're happy you're here, but so what are you interested in? I said, well, I'm a well-trained internist and endocrinologist. I also know quite a bit about chemistry. I've done a lot of basic science work, but I'd like to make a change. And see, because there are no internships or schools where you go to learn how do you become a clinical development physician, they would take someone who appears to have potential. I mean, you need to sort of know some things, even if you don't know anything about, let's say, clinical development and running global clinical trials. And they take you in, and then you join the team. And, of course, for the first couple of years, you don't know very much. It's like being the third-year medical student, okay, in many ways. But you had to be comfortable. You had to be humble and pay attention in that role. And then after 6 years, I was the global head of Bayer for diabetes and endocrine development, run out of then West Haven. So I mean, that if you pay attention, you can make rapid advancement if you really pay attention to learning.
Right. That is really a long discussion. First of all, I think you have to decide what you want. If you're looking at different practices, go in with many questions. What would be expected of me? How many patients would I be expected? If you're going to go into a group practice and have a guaranteed salary for a year, then you'd want to know what is expected of me in terms of number of patients I should see. You won't be seeing the number that I see now because I've been doing this for a lot longer, and you'll be accruing, and every new physician is really at a loss financially for the group initially, but you are hoping that they hire you so that you will, because you're giving something else to the group. So you'd want to find that out. I would also be very careful to ask questions such as about call, or what kind of call will you be expected to do. You want to understand that. You want to also have a sense of time off, perhaps. What is the expectation for holidays? How would you arrange that? CME. I think there is a discussion tomorrow at the Women in Thyroidology about this particular topic, so we'll speak of that more carefully. But whatever you end up doing, when you actually do, if you're interested in a group and you think that you've observed how the physicians relate, I think that's actually something very important. I'm lucky to be part of a practice where physicians work as a team in making decisions, and although there is a physician who's the leader or the managing partner, the interaction is very fair, and I know of groups in our town that don't get along as well. I think it's very important to observe how physicians treat one another and how they treat the staff. Those may give you some clues. My husband had talked to a group, and the physician spoke purely about money, and my husband realized, this is not the group I want to be involved in. That's not my philosophy of life, as you had mentioned about that. I think you have to get a sense about the philosophy, about how those physicians see things. I had a physician that worked with me for a year, worked with me as a partner for a year and a half. He actually died of cancer. When he came to work with me, he was so surprised that I didn't dictate certain things for him. And he asked me, I think we had a general sense of how many patients would you feel comfortable seeing, and we set that up. And he was sort of surprised about some of the freedom that we gave him. So he had been in a position before where he didn't have that. So I think you need to be very specific looking at positions. What is expected of you? What will be, your position, your requirements? Whatever you do, make sure you have someone look at your contract. Contracts are usually made by lawyers who are local to that area, and there probably are different laws from different areas. As I mentioned, ACE, if you remember, and perhaps even if you're not, has someone who's available to review a contract. And they also can help you with how much you should be, paid for that area, because it's going to be different depending on where you live. There's data on the internet about that. And, for example, ACE can help you get some of that. I don't know as a fellow, if you get these little recruiter handouts where they describe, I get them still, this beautiful place, you don't know exactly where it is, it's a little murky,
those look great.
Right, the lake that was beautiful on the picture, and they'll tell you what their starting salary is. There is a town about 2 hours from me that would get an endocrinologist and lose the endocrinologist because they would come in with a no-compete, and I don't actually think you have to be very careful about signing a no-compete, particularly if you're going to, for example, your hometown, a place you want to live, or maybe where your spouse has a job. If you sign a no-compete and it doesn't work out, you're really stuck. And I think that's something that I would advise you not sign unless you've thought through that carefully and gotten some good advice. But to have someone look over the contract, it takes some time. And see what is available. You'll be I'm not actually an expert in this because I did this once myself and been in the same place, but I have recruited, it's a case study, but I have made offers for other endocrinologists. And, I think you have to figure out what is from my perspective, if I'm really interested in someone, I'm going to make a good offer, and a place that, they'd like to have another endocrinologist, they may make a lower offer. You need to figure out what that is for you, and most likely you'll be offered that for a year or maybe 2, and then you'll be making your own overhead. I don't know if I answered all that. It's a real long, maybe you guys have some comments on that. There's so many issues involved in the...
I would just comment that the Women in Thyroidology session tomorrow, which will cover this, is not exclusive to women. If you happen not to be a woman and want to go, you are more than welcome.
Okay, I think that's me. It's about getting the first position and contracts.
My comment would be try to talk to somebody that has been in your position in that clinic that you're looking at.
Yeah.
It's like trying to find a mentor. You don't know anybody, go talk to the fellow that just graduated from somebody's lab or from somebody's program, and you can ask, how is it work with this person for 2 or 3 years? And they basically will be very honest, sometimes very candid, and but you can't just deliver yourself to somebody and commit, and sign an agreement to somebody that you don't know who, without talking to somebody that actually did work for that person. That's a real big mistake, I think.
That can be hard to do, though, to know who to talk to. I think that would be a challenge. But also, when I had someone who was looking at my practice who ended up taking a position in California to be near her husband in Hawaii, I thought she was very interesting. She spent a lot of time with my nurse. She wanted to see the electronic medical record. I think she also wanted to get to know how my nurse interacted with me. And if you have the opportunity to do that, really to get to know staff, that would be helpful.
Yeah, getting as much information as possible about that place, it's very important, I think.
I would also note that mentors are different kinds of mentors. You can have academic mentors as a fellow, but you may also have kind of work-life mentors and people who can mentor you through this kind of process as well. And seeking out mentorship from people who've done this before in your community, in your institution, to help you sort of talk through all of this is very, very valuable.
I'll give you an example. There's this guy, you probably know him, Paul Jallinger. He's in Florida. He knows everybody. So even if you're looking for a job that, it might be hard to assess that, you can go and ask him about that person because he will know. So in other words, there's always somebody around that you can go and ask about somebody else. And I think that even if it's hard to get information out of that clinic, but you can ask like a regional leader or somebody that's been around for a while, they will be able to tell you.
How do multi-specialty groups compare with like one specialty groups? That's just something I've never been able to decipher.
Yeah, you should repeat the question.
How does a multi-specialty group compare to a single specialty group? So a multi-specialty group has folks, for example, my group had a rheumatologist, gastroenterologist, endocrinologist, and then an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and then 5 primary physicians. And so I didn't practice the way the family practitioners practiced. My hallway was only endocrine, and even though we shared overhead and shared lab expenses and other auxiliaries, the way I practice was completely different. The way I practice for my husband is completely. He's a rheumatologist, and his hallway is rheumatology, my hallway is endocrine. But we share the same practice management, the same electronic medical records, so all of us had to make a decision together on what we liked. Versus a single specialty, for example, there's a group in Jacksonville, they're all endocrinologists, they would have, they would be able to share all their clinical educators, their ultrasound, but they all use it the same way. And I don't have experience in that myself. So, really when you're doing, some of this boils down to who's going to cover your patients. Because, when you're seeing your patient, no one else, whether you're in a multi-specialty or single specialty, you're going to see your own patients most likely. The question is when you're gone, who covers for you? And that may vary. And sometimes folks will, even if they're in different groups, will cover one another. In our town, we have gastroenterologists in several different groups, but they cover for each other in the hospital and for emergencies. I don't know if that answers that.
I have a few questions. Do you have a pathologist on site when you do your FNAs? Do you read your own ultrasounds? And thirdly, what's the % overhead for your practice?
So when I started, the cytopathologist was doing fine needle aspirations in the ear, nose, and throat doctor's office without ultrasound guidance. And so I realized they didn't really have time to come to my office to do it. I was trained at the Brigham to do fine needle aspiration under ultrasound guidance and put all the material into a cytolite solution. But I had a patient probably within the first year who I was very concerned about. Had a nodule. I was concerned it was cancer. It looked like cancer on the ultrasound, but the aspiration came back benign. And I convinced this ENT to take this lesion out, and it was papillary thyroid cancer. So I showed it to the cytopathologist. The surgery was actually done at a different hospital. He said, I trained in Mass General, and I trained before satellite spins, and I need to see the architecture, I need to see the slide. So I changed how I did it. And initially I had a cytopathology tech that would come and help me. But the pathology department discontinued that position, and so I do it by myself. After doing many of them, you learn quickly, what feels like adequate. And I actually started adding a microscope to see if I had adequacy later, and I never really found that helpful because I was always using the worst part of the sample for the adequacy, and I really kind of just knew if I had enough, and I did well with that. So I think initially if you start, you might want to have someone come help you, but then there probably isn't going to be time. That cytopathologist or that pathologist doesn't really have time to come to your office, but we'll be happy to take your samples to review them. I do look at my own ultrasounds. I started off with a bedside small ultrasound, and I wasn't very pleased with the images. So I've worked for 12 years with a very, very good and very careful ultrasonographer who does the ultrasounds, and then I review them. I look at them. So that was the second question. A radiologist doesn't read them, so there is just a technical fee. A radiologist would have a technical fee and a reading fee, but I don't bill the reading. That's right. Mm-hmm. And I think you asked another question. Your third question was, right, and I'm not sure if I can accurately give that information. Some of that depends on your volume. Your overhead will be higher if you don't see as many patients. And I can email you that because it's changed. I think most places, I don't want to make a misquote, so I'll text my office manager and ask her, but the more patients you see, really, it reduces your overhead in a way.
Usually a percent of,
yeah.
percent per patient usually.
Well, it depends. So much depends. For example, in this multi-specialty group with 7 or 8 physicians, we have 100 employees, so your overhead will depend on how many folks you have. You add an extra nurse to do infusions, that's another, it's another increase. So some of it depends on your volume, but I can get back because I'm afraid I think I used to know those numbers, and I really haven't paid attention to that myself recently.
So in a busy private practice like yours, how much time or how do you keep abreast with all the new information, all the literature going on in thyroid and in endocrine? New literature. What time do you have for that?
What time do I have for reviewing new information?
Yes, like
a new patient?
Not for patients, like new literature coming on new medications, new studies. What time do you...
Right. So I read a lot at night. My evenings are usually in front of an electronic medical record looking over labs and sometimes answering messages that I haven't had a chance to answer for that day that aren't a high priority. And I usually read at night, whether it's trying to review for endocrine practice, which is done at night or weekends. And I really appreciate things like the clinical thyroidology that the American Thyroid Association has. That's a great way to get a survey. When I get a journal, when I get JCEM, I look at the table of contents and quickly look and see what I want to read. And sometimes, I'll look and just read a few abstracts, and other times I'll read the whole, but I'll know, I saw that, where was that, JCEM, and I can pull that up quickly, look back. In the beginning, I think I really had to use a lot. I went to the internet a lot to read about, okay, now how do we take care of that, patient with, whatever it is, an adrenal incident, and I'd read a lot. And then after seeing so many patients with that, it just becomes part of your practice. So in the very beginning, my practice wasn't as busy, and I would read on every patient I saw. I would read a couple papers. And so it's and when another thing is when I started, I would often see the new patients the night before I get the records, and I'd see what the problems were, and if I wasn't familiar exactly with that disorder, particularly the pediatric patients that I was inheriting, I would read a couple articles. ahead of time. I don't do that now. But I did in the beginning. It's almost hard to remember what it was like in the beginning.
So, do you dedicate like a half day a week for calling patients back with the results, or do you have to delegate this to someone else, or is this something that we need to look for when we start looking for jobs? Having some sort of protected time to do like a review of everything, and since we all do so much labs.
Is that for me or
for anyone? Yeah.
I think depending on your practice setting, I think that would be a very good thing to look into before you accept a position. In my academic setting, I see patients in an academic setting, and I also see them in a very large multi-specialty practice. In my multi-specialty practice clinic, I can delegate. I can sort of go through the lab's review and say, can you please make these phone calls, and my nurse knows what to do. In the academic setting, it's all me. There's really not any support, and that takes an enormous amount of time, as you know.
I think we're actually just about out of time, so I want to thank all of you for coming. I think it was a great panel and a great opportunity to ask questions. And everyone here is going to be at the meeting. Please feel free, they're all here, come up and talk to them and ask